Hello and welcome to Davenant Hall Faculty Spotlight. I am Nathan Johnson, the Provost of Davenant Hall. And joining me today is Dr. Matthew Hoskin, Professor of Church History. Dr. Matthew Hoskin, welcome to Davenant Hall Faculty Spotlight.
Thank you very much. Great to be here, Nathan.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, your areas of study, how you got involved with Davenant Hall.
Sure, yes. So my name is Matthew Hoskin, and I teach Christian history at Davenant Hall, Professor of Christian History, and my own research is primarily patristics, but my teaching also extends through the Middle Ages. My PhD thesis was a study of manuscripts that transmit letters of Pope Leo the Great, and so I do have this breadth of things that I can do from ancient through medieval. But my favorite place to play is the late antiquity, whether we're doing canon law, monks, Latin poetry, imperial history. Just give me this like sort of 285 with Diocletian up to Justinian or even Maximus the Confessor. We're doing ecclesiastical stuff. That's my favorite place to play.
So it sounds like you like to play in a lot of different kinds of sandboxes, just as long as it's in that era.
Yes, I do.
Well, how did you find yourself interested in that specific era of history and church history?
Well, I always wanted to do classics, and so I studied classics at university, and I loved it. And as I was going through, I got this, which people like Gillian Clark has proven false, idea that most of the classicists I was reading who were doing work on ancient Christianity didn't really seem like Christians to me, like people like Tim Barnes. I choose him because he explicitly says he's not a Christian, as opposed to guesses I may have made about other people. So he's a fair target. And I felt like a lot of the Christians I found writing about ancient Christianity tended not to be classicists. They tended to be theologians with proper theological training, but not necessarily training in ancient history and philology at the same level. And so I thought, you know what I could do when I go on to get my PhD is I would bring these two things together and do, as a Christian within the field of classics, doing ancient history and philology on ancient Christianity. So that's that's where this idea came from. And I studied with some really extraordinary late antique scholars at the University of Ottawa, and then University of Toronto as well, before going to the University of Edinburgh, where there's a really great team who does ancient Christianity in divinity as well as late antiquity in classics, and I got to work on both sides of that there, which is where I met Brad Littlejohn, the president of Davenant, which answers the question I forgot to answer: how did you get involved in Davenant Hall? Well, I was looking for a job, and I was like, oh, what's Brad up to? And I discovered he had was deeply involved with this, and I was really excited, and so I reached out to him.
And here you are today.
Here I am.
Well, tell us a little bit more about how your study of classics and kind of coming at Christian history from a classics perspective kind of lends an important kind of vantage point to theology that maybe kind of your typical theologian might be missing.
Sure. So a really great example of how coming with sort of this classics vantage point can help is I just finished teaching St. Augustine's City of God, which is one of the biggest things, not the biggest thing he wrote. Actually, that's his book on the Psalms, but one of the biggest single texts of the ancient world. And because I have primary training in classics, I read it and I see it in this context of the late Roman world and what's going on in later Latin literature as well. And so I can see things that Augustine is doing with that tradition, such as the way he's sort of he uses the Bible in this really interesting way throughout City of God to subvert all of the pagans' expectations. Like he'll say, oh, you Romans, here's Lucretia, you think she's a great example. And then he says, well, actually, this isn't the Bible, but he uses, look at our martyrs. Aren't they a better example than a suicide? Or, here's some other virtuous pagan, shows how they're not as great as you'd think, and then uses the example of Job or something from Scripture. And so being able to read those historical examples in City of God and be sort of I spent more time reading Livy in my training than I did reading Augustine initially. To be able to find all of those Livy references in City of God and say, I see what he's doing here. but also to tie it into the own period. There are people writing around the same time as him, these sort of last pagan holdouts, like this guy called Macrobius, who wrote this book called the Saturnalia. And the Saturnalia is just like all about Latin poetry and treating Virgil's Aeneid literally like a sacred text. And so you can see, if you sort of move Augustine, not just City of God, but beyond, he's creating an entire literary culture that is focused on sacred scripture, that ends up rivaling and triumphing over this culture that was living at the same time with people like Macrobius or Symmachus, just to name some of the famous names of the era, who were focused upon Virgil. And so Augustine, who was raised in that culture, it's sort of like part of his cultural project, which is, of course, subservient to the theological project. The cultural project is to create a Christian culture with the Bible at the center, the way his pagan contemporaries had done it with Virgil. So that's the sort of thing that because I'm the kind of guy who's read Virgil and Macrobius and all these things, I can tie them into Augustine in a way where equally valid readings from colleagues who are more trained in theology will be able to be seeing sort of influences that Augustine has later on. I can sort of see him interacting with his pagan contemporaries.
So Augustine's obviously the main theologian of the Western Church during this time period. What are some of the other theologians that you study within this context?
So my main guy for my research has been Pope Leo the Great. He was Bishop of Rome from 440 to 461. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I have studied over 300 manuscripts that have between 1 and 114 of his letters in them from throughout the Middle Ages. And so he's super important because his articulation of Christology is what was embraced by the church, both East and West, at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. He also was one of the main orchestrators of the council. He and the Emperor Marcian made sure it happened and went a certain way. So, and that Christology is that Christ exists in two natures, and one human and one divine, and that they exist together without confusion, but without separation. So it's trying to balance, on the one hand, this dude called Nestorius, who basically made the separation between the divine and human so much it was two persons inhabiting one guy. This is saying, no, it's a single person, but also the humanity still maintains all the fullness of what it means to be human. And so that means there's another guy called Eutyches, where basically what happens with his is it's hard to know, because it's hard to know if he knew what he was trying to say, where the divinity seems to almost be subsuming the humanity. And so it's trying to maintain the fullness of both of them as distinct yet completely united entities in the hypostatic union. So Leo's articulation of that, which he does in a perfectly traditional Western way that Hilary, Augustine, and Ambrose before him would all have recognized, his way of putting it together succinctly in a few pages is the one that was embraced by both the Eastern, all the portions of the church officially within the boundaries of the Roman Empire. And so then his Christology is the Christology of the Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and all sane Protestant churches, yes. Or we might call them real Protestant churches, Davenant types.
Right.
So he's my main other theologian. But
so how have you found that your students respond to your approach, taking in the history and the literature and the philosophy as important background material to understanding some of the great theologians of the early church?
They seem to really appreciate it. I think sometimes they come more ready to talk about sort of and a rightful question, the appropriation of the doctrines of the fathers by the Reformed tradition a lot of the time, which is a worthy thing to be asking yourself. And so it's an important question, but I'm always like, well, in my classes, that's not the question I'm asking, but you can ask it for yourself. But they seem to appreciate sort of being able to see these figures, people like Augustine and Leo, and I've taught Athanasius as well. I've done a lot on the Greek fathers of the 4th century. I've taught on them quite a bit as well. And to be able to see them as these sort of, I guess, fully more rounded figures is what this enables you to do. And it's sort of like you get to see the richness of what these men are actually here to talk about, as opposed to you might just get them as like these in a different context as sort of like a one-hit wonder. Here's their famous doctrine, right? So Augustine, if people say they're Augustinian, mostly what they mean is they believe in predestination, right? And so you say, well, what are all of the other things that this most famous of Western theologians had to say? Oh, he wrote more Latin than any other ancient writer. That's a lot of stuff to take in, and most of it's not about predestination. So sort of being able to see them in this context as men of their own time who are concerned with the issues of their own time, I think the students really, they seem to appreciate it. They don't complain about it anyway.
Oh, I'm sure. It sounds like a refreshing approach to studying theology and stretching as well. Well, tell us a little bit more about the courses that you'll be teaching in the coming year.
Yes, so this coming year, starting in Michaelmas term this autumn, I am teaching Augustine the Preacher. So taking sort of coming from City of God, which is one of his big famous works, to some of his other works, one of which we're going to look at is the De Doctrina Christiana, which is his sort of handbook on preaching, which in the Middle Ages was his most popular work. It's the most copied of them all because it's the most hands-on. And then looking at a variety of his sermons, sort of seeing him, and not just as a theologian who's writing treatises for other, literate people, but the man who is preaching for 40 years of his life to the people of Hippo Regius and opening up the scriptures to them, sharing the gospel, and seeing what that looks like, coming from a man who's also a trained orator. So lots of fun stuff going on in that course. My next course I'm taking up for Hilary term in January of 2024 is Constantine and the conversion of the later Roman Empire. So going to be mixing a bit of politics and religion there, the two things you're not allowed to talk about at Thanksgiving. But it's also some really big important questions there. And one of the other things about my approach is that I'm not here to pass judgment one way or the other on Constantine. I'm not going to write a book like Peter Leithart did. That's Peter Leithart's job. My job is to get the students to see the actual complicatedness. I'm not saying that Leithart doesn't see complications, but I'm not going to write a book in defense of Constantine, but I'm going to help my students see the nuances and complicated things that are going on in ecclesiastical history. Because with a guy like Constantine, you will often get people be like, oh, you end up with faith a mile wide and an inch deep, and he's not that great for Christianity, or an older narrative, which today tends to mostly only be a certain kind of Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox believer that, he's Saint Constantine the Great, and he's equal to the apostles and all these titles that he got in antiquity. And what I want to do is, well, look, he's a flawed man, but what did he do, and what are the purposes of God that are fulfilled by divine providence as a result? So that's sort of looking at that, but not just, it starts with Constantine, but the course will do if you want to get to the Christianization, you have to go a bit after him. So we're going to see his sons and the Summer of Blood, and there's going to be violence, and it's going to be glorious. I'll make you read poetry. And then after that, for Trinity term, we're going to be looking at, it's a course on ritual and worship, or worship in space, I think I called it, in the ancient church. Looking at not just at liturgies, but also at the archaeological remains for how ancient Christians worshipped and what they actually did in certain of the spaces. So partly, some of my courses I have a myth busting in the background. So this one is, what are the catacombs and what goes on there? And the answer is, they're where you bury dead people. They're not where people live. Anyway, so that's one of the things. But we're going to be looking at sort of these origins of Christian worship, looking at a lot at sort of Holy Communion, as well as the rituals of baptism, as well as sort of the basilicas of probably a lot of the ones from Rome, because Rome is an unusual city, which makes it both tempting and dangerous because it has so many really cool old things, but it's not normal. Just because you have this many basilicas in Rome doesn't mean that a city with a similar size of Christian population would be doing the same sorts of things as the people in Rome. So.
Well, it sounds like if somebody is a fan or interested in the Greco-Roman world, these particularly are not classes that people want to miss. I think the Augustine the Preacher course that you're going to be teaching in the fall, it's going to be particularly juicy. On Christian Doctrines, one of my favorite Augustine texts.
Yeah, it was so good. This will be like my second time teaching it, and I don't know how many times having read it, and there's something there every time to go deep with. So.
Yeah, I don't know why more seminaries don't require that as a text. One of the things that I find very moving and challenging about it is he talks a lot about rhetoric and a lot about how we need to persuade, and we need to teach, we need to delight, but ultimately we need Christian character, and that's certainly something that the even us modern day preachers need to hear, that you can have rhetoric, but first and foremost you need to have character and wisdom.
Yes, character and wisdom. And this actually, if you read Surviving, whenever any of the ancient Christians talk about the duty of preaching and or what is the job of being a presbyter or a bishop, they talk about how important character is, that you're not worth, it's almost like none of us are worthy to do theology at a certain level. And if you're not even trying, you're definitely not worthy. And if you are teaching, you'd better be seeking God's grace that he may make you worthy, because the sanctity of your life, and the sanctity of your life isn't just a matter of your personal holiness, but they believe it actually has a public and outward manifestation on the things that you do. So if you're unholy, how can you actually bring the words of life to people if you are consciously living in sin? And so then people like St. Gregory of Nazianzus, I was just reading some of his today, where he says many of the same things about growing in true character as being a prerequisite for being able to preach. So
timely words. Well, are there any publications, things that you're writing, things that we can be on the lookout for?
Well, I don't know when it's going to come out, but many of you Davenant people may know of Austin Freeman, who wrote his book Tolkien Dogmatics recently, and he's written a few things for Ad Fontes in the past. He is editing a book based on a symposium he organized called Tolkien Among the Theologians, and I'm contributing the chapter on Tolkien and Boethius, where I look at some of the Boethian themes to do with good and evil, power and fate in The Lord of the Rings. So that was a delight to write. I'm starting to dabble into Tolkien studies now. So that was really fun to bring Boethius and Tolkien into dialogue there. And that's probably my most likely thing to come out anytime soon. I am in the middle of writing another article about the Desert Fathers, because monks are my other big thing, and their Eucharistic practice, and what is the place of Holy Communion in their lives, because you sort of, even amongst scholars and amongst those who do devotion, rightly enough, because this is what they're famous for, we go to the earliest monks of Egypt, Palestine, Syria, for the heroic feats, or for the solitude and the lone things that they do, sort of. But one of the notable things about their actual lifestyles, if you start looking at it, is they have a weekly gathering for Holy Communion. And so spending my summer going through my large monastic collection and hunting down all of the references to the Holy Communion to talk about what is their practice and what is their theology, and what does this look like for a bunch of desert monks, as a reminder for us today.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, we'll be on the lookout for both of those.
Thanks.
Well, as we wrap up, I wonder if you might kind of explain to our listeners and viewers why they should consider taking classes at Davenant Hall.
You should consider taking classes at Davenant Hall because my colleagues and I are bringing you straight into direct contact with the greatest books of the Christian intellectual heritage, as well as the philosophical roots of the Western society. So you will, if you study with me, you're going to read almost nothing about the Church Fathers, but Colin Redimer does Plato and Aristotle, right? And these are super important if you want to understand all sorts of developments in Western thought. And or you want to know Thomas Aquinas, we have Ryan Hurd. If you want to do Reformation stuff, we have Brad and all sorts of other people, and Michael Lynch, and all of these men who are helping you yourself read for yourself and then figure out how rightly to interpret in their contexts, and often for today, these like important works. Like I have not just listed a bunch of obscure guys, right? These are people who are fundamental for the making of a Christian world, a Christian culture. They ask all of the guys that we want you to read and help you become good readers of, whether it's Richard Hooker or George Herbert, because we do poetry in some of our courses as well, or St. Augustine or any of them. They're all, not only they're big names for a reason, that these classic texts have become classics precisely because they were found over generations to be worth reading. And if you want to learn how to do theology, how to think clearly about the things of God, how to read scripture faithfully, and do it all for today, and do it all gaining insights not only from top-notch scholars, but also from your fellow students. I always learn something from my students in my classes, and so that's also really great. The seminar aspect of the courses is really good for bringing out things as well. If you want to do this, and not just read a book, but go deeper with it, this is one of the best venues for that, for good, solid, orthodox, small o, Christian orthodox, intellectually faithful and vibrant study would be Davenant Hall.
Why would you not want to study at Davenant Hall? Well, that was Dr. Matthew Hoskin. If you want to enroll in his courses in the next year, in the fall term, he's teaching Augustine the Preacher. In winter term, Constantine and the Conversion of the Later Roman Empire, and Trinity term, Worship and Space and the Ancient Church. You do not want to miss these. Dr. Hoskin, thank you so much for joining us on today's Davenant Hall Faculty Spotlight.
Thank you.